The following is an independently produced community access program. The viewpoints expressed are those of the community access producer and do not reflect those of Shaw Cable Systems. The program is presented in response to CRTC policy guidelines regulating community programming.
I'm Ron MacIsaac, and my guest is Bill Bresser of the Metis Nation. Welcome, Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Appreciate the opportunity to be on your show.
Now, some people may not know what Metis people are. Do you want to go into the history a bit?
Well, Metis people go back a good many years. Actually, my lineage, I can trace it back to the late 1600s, coming to Canada from France. And on my maternal side, I can take it back to the early 1800s, coming from Ireland, in fact, to through the Hudson's Bay Company to Manitoba. And Metis people were a combination of Western Europeans marrying native brides and having children, and from that began what some people would call half-breeds or Metis. These people in turn married within that culture Metis to Metis, and over a period of time they established distinct settlements across Western Canada.
Now, the trouble that we hear about, the Riel rebellions and so on and so forth, what caused that?
Well, the Riel rebellion started with the government of Canada exerting colonial rights on what was then Rupert's land after the Hudson's Bay sold that land to Canada, and Canada's exertion of rights over the land in contradiction to what the Metis felt was their land.
Mm-hmm. And it was their land.
It was their land, and in fact, if you go into some of the history of legislation, you look at the Manitoba Act in the late 1800s, in fact, it was agreed that land would be set aside for the Metis, which never came to fruition.
So why did the government want to end these long, narrow strips of land that the Metis farmed, which were fronting on the rivers so they get their canoes in the water?
I would suspect, I don't know all the particulars, but I suspect it was to have a more organized structure similar to what maybe they had elsewhere in Canada, but certainly it was in contradiction to what the Metis required. They were canoe people. Access to the water was the highways, and certainly it went against what they required for their business.
Yeah. I remember reading about how they were given this scrip, which entitled them to a quarter section or maybe 4 quarter sections when they stole their land away from them. And of course these quarter sections looked useless because there was no roads and there was no railroads.
Exactly, and some of my ancestors actually had scrip as well, Ron. But you go back to the Manitoba Act, the scrip was also promised to the children of the Metis settlement in the Red River at the time, which numbered most likely in the area of about 6,000 to 7,000 children. That land was never ceded to those children.
I remember reading that the 2 wealthiest families in Canada based their fortunes on giving $5 or a bottle of whiskey for that piece of scrip because they knew the railroads were coming.
It's certainly part of the history if you go back, you know, from what the Metis would state as well.
Yeah, I know the names of that family, but I won't mention them. Now, who was Louis Riel?
Louis Riel was a prominent figure within the Metis community, a politician who took on the Canadian government of the day in an effort to ensure rights for the Metis people. He wasn't that successful in it. He did mount a number of rebellious actions, and as a result fled south of the border into the United States on 2 occasions.
Manitoba and Saskatchewan.
That's correct.
2 separate rebellions.
Exactly. The most notable one, I guess, would be the Battle of Batoche and Duck Lake. And after that, there was a trial, and Louis Riel was tried for treason and subsequently hung as a traitor.
Yeah, in those days they hung people. That was shocking.
Yeah.
But how about the buffalo?
Well, and that's part, if you go back in history, with when settlers started moving out into traditional Métis territory in likely the mid-1800s, there was fewer buffalo around, and with the colonization of Canada and the movement of settlers coming in, many of the Métis lost their traditional ways of life and ended up in poverty and being unaccepted by the new settlers.
Yeah. I remember that famous writer Louis L'Amour was always claiming that the Wild West was a United States phenomena, but there's a book out currently right now that says that our Wild West was even worse.
I'm not familiar with that book, Ron.
Yeah, I forget the name of it, but I'll lend it to you, Bill.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
But in any event, it certainly was a Wild West for the Métis.
It was,
yeah,
for sure.
And in Saskatchewan, I believe they had formed an alliance with a man called Big Bear, who was a full-blooded...
There were a couple of Aboriginal chiefs who came to the aid of the Métis in support of what they felt was wrongdoing by the colonial government of the day.
Now, of course, this is much later, and you're the president of the Métis for Greater Victoria. So what's your job?
Well, my job, the Metis Nation of Greater Victoria, is one of 37 chartered communities within British Columbia that fall under the Metis Nation of British Columbia. It's a political organization. Metis Nation of British Columbia started in 1985, following the repatriation of the Constitution and the 1982 decision that Métis would be recognized as one of the distinct Aboriginal peoples of Canada.
Now, what are the rights of the Aborigine people, Métis, as compared to those of the native Indians or Aborigines?
It's an evolutionary process, Ron. In some parts of Canada, there have been land grants to Métis specifically. For example, some case law and legal opinion in the past would suggest that the Manitoba Act, for example, is in fact a treaty with the Métis, which has never been honored. On a side note of that, it's interesting that I believe it's on December the 13th, the Manitoba Act and how it did not serve the Métis as was promised is going before the Supreme Court of Canada for argument. But going back to land grants, those also happened in Saskatchewan and Alberta to Métis. On occasion they were rescinded but reinstated. So there is actually been land provision made to the Métis in the prairie provinces, but not in BC, which continues to not recognize Métis right.
Well, as aside from rights, I always found that the Metis culture was very interesting and exciting. They have the clothing they wear, the sash they wear, the jigs they do.
Absolutely, and that's one of the key components of the Metis Nation of Greater Victoria is
that
to
holds
support
them together, eh?
Exactly. It's part of to be a culture. There's certain things that make you distinctive, and in the case of the Métis, we have a distinctive language. We speak our own language called Michif. We have our own art. We own our own traditions and practices. So all of these things come together and create a distinctive culture.
Well, Bill, I was going to ask you to do a jig, but limited time, so I'll not have you doing a jig.
Wouldn't be pretty in any case, Rod.
But I bet you've done one when you were younger, eh?
Absolutely.
Yeah, of course. And you have a sash, I know. I've seen you.
Yes, I do wear a sash. I don't generally wear a sash when I wear my ceremonial tunic, which I'm wearing today.
Yeah, the one you've got right now is very, very interesting. Did you have that done recently?
About 5 years ago, I had a lady do it up for me, and you notice that it's beaded in the traditional way, and this goes back to when Europeans first came to Canada and started trading beads with the Aboriginal people. They started beading, and so Métis, who are also called flower people in some cases, took up the art of beading, and so what I'm wearing is a traditional beaded tunic. The tunic being sort of, they looked at the tunic that were worn by the military in the 1800s, copied that with, you know, using leather, and then beaded on that leather with different flowers. So in my case, my tunic has a story. On the back, you don't see it from where you're sitting, but on the back I have like a family tree that shows my heritage, kind of from flowers, showing my origins in Manitoba right through. And if you look on my sleeve, you'll see that I have cedar to represent British Columbia. Oh. So I have a pictorial flower history of my origins.
Well, that's very interesting. I understand too that you married into the Scottish side of the Métis. I did, for sure. What was their maiden name?
Cameron.
Wow, you couldn't touch that, eh? I know when I went to those islands north of Scotland, on the ferry boat, they said that the people of the islands were all Canadian Indians, the way they put it. So I went into a store and I said that the reason that was is they forced the native people around Hudson Bay to take the ships back, and then they dumped the poor guys in the islands north of Scotland and carry on down to Southampton and then hire white men to come back to Canada. So that would be part of the source of Métis people in Canada, eh?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, the Orkney Islands were a big source of not Métis people, but fathers of Métis people.
Yeah, that's correct. Have you been there yet?
I've never been to the British Isles. No.
Oh, you've gone
over it, but not to it.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Orkney is a great place to visit, though.
Oh, I'm sure it is.
I've been twice, and I really like it. They've got these big stone circles like Stonehenge there.
Oh, yeah.
And when you go to see them, there's nobody there. That's the nice part about it. Well, Bill, what are you going to do for your people, your own personal objective?
Well, we have our main objective with our community in Victoria. We have about, I'd say, 800 members in the Greater Victoria area. And our big objective is support of our culture and support of our youth, support of our elders, and things that we can do to support healthy living, promote tradition, language. And so to that end, we have a number of key initiatives going on. As well, we work in close liaison with the local school districts, and we are actually work in concert with them to provide Métis awareness education within the school system.
Well, education is one of your big pushes, isn't it?
Absolutely, and we wherever we can promote role modeling so that our young people will see successful Métis people and strive to work towards that. And I say this because if you look at Aboriginal people in Canada generally, we have been struggling to be successful in the school system, to be as successful health-wise as other people. So it really is important that we keep pushing all these initiatives for our people.
Well, our time's up, Bill, and thank you very much for coming in.
Welcome.
Because you've given us a fascinating talk.
Appreciate the opportunity, Ron.
And then we have another person being interviewed in a minute.
You're watching an independently produced community access program. The viewpoints expressed are those of the community access producer and do not reflect those of Shaw Cable Systems. The program is presented in response to CRTC policy guidelines regulating community programming.
Ron MacIsaac here, and my guest is Robert Mulligan QC, a prominent lawyer, very adept at criminal cases. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for your kind greeting. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Now, in the papers recently, Robert, we have indications that our Prime Minister, Harper, is planning on making various amendments to the criminal code. Would you be able to tell the audience what those are and their effects?
It is difficult to capture it all because what's happened here is that the government has introduced an omnibus bill which now includes the content of what previously amounted to several separate bills that have been debated in previous parliaments. They've passed this omnibus bill through the House of Commons. It's now in the Senate, and it will be probably the largest criminal law related legislation in the history of Parliament, except perhaps for the adoption of the Criminal Code in 1892. It has that much content to it. Covers not only the Criminal Code, but also the drug legislation, the pardon legislation, and other legislation related to this field. The government saying that this is what they've promised us. They were elected with a majority the last time, and now we're getting it.
Well, now I understand that they're going to sentence people to more time.
That's one of the outcomes of this legislation if it's passed, as it's likely to be, particularly because of the addition of more minimum penalties to offenses in the criminal law, and also because of the elimination of a very wise concept introduced in the mid-90s for conditional sentences, which allowed for the serving of some sentences of imprisonment in the community. Those are going to be reduced in terms of their availability, which will mean more individuals will serve time in actual close confinement.
Now, I'm from Prince Albert, where we had both a penitentiary and a provincial jail. And I recall that the prisons were maximized. They were, sometimes there were two men put in one room. And the abuses, as you know, some of the guards who were corrupt would sell a young boy to an older pedophile, and he would go into the cell with the pedophile. I imagine you're aware of those kind of abuses.
Yes, those are extreme circumstances, and the good news is we do have now a very professional correctional service corps. But of course, bad things happen in any area of life, including in prisons. The most important part of what you've just said, however, is that we are very crowded at the present time. I'm speaking now of the spaces in prison. Many individuals are double bunked, and it's not uncommon for some to have to sleep on the floor in some crowded remand centers for a period of time, because more than 2 prisoners per cell are entered into that system. And we even have odd circumstances of individuals being double bunked in what's called segregation. The problem is going to be exacerbated by the new legislation, because we're going to have more individuals entering the prison system. And while the government is saying that they are building more prison space, they may not be able to build it fast enough. In any event, as you know well, prison is an entirely negative experience for most individuals, and what we end up doing is taking individuals who have social deficits or personal development deficits or serious personal challenges and putting them in the most unnatural of social circumstances, that is, crowded with only members of the same gender being kept in these overcrowded units. It's a very unhealthy environment, and so the bottom line is we should use imprisonment sparingly. This legislation is going in the opposite direction, and it's, in my respectful opinion, contrary to the public interest in terms of the effect it will have on individuals and their families, not just while they're in prison, but the long-term effects of being in prison unnecessarily.
Yeah, I read that magazine put out by the prisoners out here, and I see your name in there occasionally. And the editor was a man named Love. Do you know him?
Ryan Love.
Yeah. So he's out now, and somebody else will become the editor. But they have some very provocative topics in that magazine, and they go along the lines of what you've just said.
Yes, it's a wonderful publication that has endured for many years, to the credit of the prisoners who work on it, including Ryan Love and many others, and also the staff, to the extent that they've been able to see fit to allow it to continue, because you have the expression in that publication of prisoners who are actually in the experience as they're writing, and so it's a very valuable publication.
Well, do you think that the federal government is unaware of this fallout, this negative fallout of their proposed legislation?
I would say no. They appear to be well aware of the criticism of the legislation, and their response, to put it in summary form, is we recognize there's a cost to people being imprisoned, and more people being imprisoned will be more cost. But we as the government take the view that there's a cost to people committing crimes. And so if they're taken off the street, they won't be committing crimes, at least for the period of time that they're in prison. And so that has to be put in the balance. The other reason I think it's perhaps more important is an ideological one. They wish to appear to be tough on crime because it's a cheap political fuel. And they'll say that we as members of the public asked for this and elected them, and now we're getting what we asked for. So I do have some concerns about the extent to which the citizenry can be blamed for this legislation. And I think there is some substance to that because of the constant criticism of the justice system, the most common theme of which is it's too soft, nothing happened, individuals got a slap on the wrist, I have no faith in the system is all about the criminal and not the victims. That's a constant drip, drip, drip theme, which is entirely corrosive to our administration of justice. The closer you are to a case, the more you realize that it's not as simple as sending everyone to jail. But the theme we see in the media frequently is that if people are not sent to jail for a long time, somehow there's been a failure, which is, I'm sorry to say, a complete lack of sophistication in what's actually occurring in the criminal justice system.
Well, you're right about that drip business, because it also can be on the good side. Because when I first started to practice law, we had stipendiary magistrates. They only got paid if they found the guy guilty, and they only got what paid the court costs. And what I did is I joined about 150 organizations and sent in resolutions from each one to W.A.C. Bennett saying that we should get rid of this terrible stipendiary magistrate system. And he did, immediately. He figured it was a huge public outcry, you see.
Well, you've mentioned something that's very worthwhile noting, and that is we have a very well-trained and well-qualified judiciary in this country. It is probably the best in the world, and it's one of the reasons why we should not be as critical of the system as the media reports I've referred to a moment ago are. We can count on our judges, generally speaking, to be responsible and reasonable and careful about what they do. And where mistakes are made, and of course mistakes can be made because it's a human system, we also have a very well-respected appeal system. So I say that the criticism of the justice system, which has produced this omnibus bill, is not well-founded. We've come a long way from the days you've mentioned, which would be quite worrisome when we had not so well-trained judiciary.
Well, it came from England, where the magistrate was of noble blood. He owned all the land in England, or among them they did, so that they didn't need any money. So he would acquit. But our magistrates back in 1949, they needed the money. But anyway, what do you think can be done by the law societies and the Canadian Bar Association and individual lawyers to change what's about to descend upon us?
Two things. One is that there are likely to be some constitutional challenges to the application of this legislation in due course, which might lead to some improvement in the negative effects. In the longer run, this is a political question. Just like this bill has been introduced and is passing through a majority parliament, it can be amended or removed altogether in due course when the political winds change and the government changes. Right-thinking people will realize that tying the judge's hands and requiring a minimum sentence for all cases falling under a particular section just doesn't make sense. You're actually going to create injustice by sending people to prison who don't deserve to be there. There are also some other effects of minimum sentences which are important that may not be readily available, and one of them is you put a coercive power in the hands of the prosecutor once you introduce some minimum sentences, because the prosecutor can say to an accused, in effect, plead guilty to another offense that doesn't have a minimum, or else we'll prosecute you for this minimum sentence offense. And you should not put coercive power in the hands of the prosecutor in any system.
Yeah, I see that. That's interesting. I never thought of that. Well, I know that Brian Mulroney would never do anything like this, so it's not anything to do with the Conservative Party. I don't criticize the Conservative Party. I think this is the individual thinking of our present Prime Minister.
It might be, and it might be shared by some of his colleagues that come from the Reform Party wing of the government, because of the harsh stand taken on criminal justice-related matters on that wing for many years. I'm worried about a book that I understand is about to hit the shelves soon that's entitled The Death of Liberal Canada, and they're not just talking, I think, here about the Liberal Party with a capital L, but that sense of balance and progressiveness that was part of the Canadian political landscape, including Prime Minister Mulroney, has fallen into a minority position at the moment.
Well, it was interesting to see the Quebec elect a whole bunch of NDP youngsters, eh? But the criticism of the NDP about themselves is that they're not socialists anymore. You've heard that?
Yes, that term has become a negative term, and so some try to disassociate themselves from it.
It's like communism has a bad name, and yet communism, to each according to his need, from each according to his ability, was what Jesus Christ preached.
Yes, and there's lots of value to that philosophy. The problem came in its application in authoritarian regimes, and that's why the term became such a negative term.
Stalin.
Yes.
Yeah. Stalin was a bad man. Well, now, before we wind up here, Robert, what do you recommend that people do?
What I recommend they do is stay engaged. Politics is a game of engagement, and those who care need to continue to express their opposition to legislation which is unwise or unfair. We have some opportunity there because this legislation is going to cost money. And the argument is very powerful to say we should not be spending money on building prisons, but perhaps doing something for the other compelling needs in society, one of which has come to our attention in the last few days, and that is the terrible conditions on the territory of some Aboriginal communities around the country. It's shameful. We should be spending money solving that rather than building prisons, which, by the way, will lock up a disproportionate percentage of our Aboriginals.
They won't nail you and I, unfortunately. Well, thank you, Robert, for coming in. And that's it for this show. Thank you for watching. It's Ron MacIsaac saying adios.
The proceeding was an independently produced community access program. The viewpoints expressed are those of the community access producer and do not reflect those of Shaw Cable Systems. The program is presented in response to CRTC policy guidelines regulating community programming.